So hi everyone, welcome to our ethics seminar series. This is the last one this year. We'll be back next January. And so today it's our great pleasure to have Professor Sauleh Siddiqui with us. So Sauleh is an assistant professor of civil engineering and applied mathematics and statistics and the Whiting School of Engineering of Johns Hopkins University. He is a co-director of the Center for Systems Science and Engineering and research fellow at the DIW Berlin. His primary area of research is mathematical modeling and data science applied to global change and human health for long-term resilience. His vision is to further the interdisciplinary science through mathematical modeling by collecting diverse models of human and social behavior, function, and outcome. He received the BA in mathematics and public policy from Franklin and Marshall College and a PhD in applied mathematics and statistics and scientific computation from University of Maryland here. Prior to joining Hopkins, he was an associate in the environmental markets team and ICF International, and also a consultant with the development research group and the World Bank. Let's welcome the speaker.
Thanks so much, John, and thank you for inviting me to this. For many reasons, I'm very excited to be here. But like John mentioned, I got my PhD at College Park, so it's almost like coming home. Although I work in Baltimore now, but I live in DC, so I kind of am in the area. But it still feels like that I'm getting closer and closer to home. Awesome. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about multi-scale food, energy, water resilience under human and natural shocks. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a methodology that we use to kind of get at certain problems in this space. To start off with, just to give you an idea of what type of place we'll be looking at, does anyone want to tell me which country this is or where this is? Anyone know? Anyone want to take a guess? You can shout it out, and then I'll replay it in my mic so everyone else can hear. Okay, we have a continent, the African continent. Any other ideas? Ethiopia. How did you guess that? Read the abstract. First test passed. So this is Ethiopia. This is the top of Choke Mountain in Ethiopia, and I'll show you a map of Ethiopia to show you where this is. But I really like this figure because I think it really captures the essence of the research really, really well. You can also see some of our partners in research over here. So these are a bunch of students that we went to Ethiopia with. These are some Ethiopian students who work with us on this research. Then that's Ben Zajcik. He was the PI of the project. And that's Ying Zhang, who's right there. Sitting over there. So a lot of the stuff I'll present is stuff that Ying worked on as well. And so, this is part of a large collaborative effort to look at food, energy, and water resilience in Ethiopia. But why is this interesting? So if you look at over here, Choke Mountain rests at a very sort of highland, and for someone like me who's a mathematical modeler, but not necessarily an Earth system scientist, it was very interesting to kind of look at this thing. So if you look at this tree line right here, that's where the tree stopped. This tree line actually came all the way over here. And in fact, if you walk over here, it's like really spongy ground. So it's really, really full of water. And there's small little, sort of rivers that start off over here and eventually flow into the Blue Nile. So this is kind of, the Ethiopians describe this as kind of where the water of the world comes from. So all the water sort of starts off from these highlands and then flows into the Nile. And then eventually, a bunch of the countries north of Ethiopia take advantage of that as well. This tree line used to be over here, right there, and it's very interesting because Ethiopia, as a test bed for these things, provides a very, very nice angle to look at it. So first thing, Ethiopia is an exporter of food, not a net exporter, just an exporter of food. So there are other countries that depend on Ethiopia for food. However, Ethiopia is severely food insecure, as all of you know. Ethiopia generates 100% of its electricity from renewable sources. but only so majority of that comes from hydro, some from thermal, some from geothermal, not even fossil fuel power plants, and so but only 30% of the country is electrified, which means that 90% of Ethiopia's energy consumption are these trees like this. So if you look at this particular thing right here, the trees used to be all the way over here, but if majority of the country's energy consumption comes from chopping down these trees and using biomass, then you're sort of left with changing this particular ecosystem right here. And so this was one of the big problems that when we were in Ethiopia, we talked about how a bunch of the trees are being chopped down, but also this impacts the water that's flowing down. It impacts the ecosystem over here, but also even more downstream, it impacts what kind of land use results in Ethiopia on their farmland. So a lot of the crops, one of the issues that's happening in Ethiopia is that some of the farmland is being replaced by trees, particularly eucalyptus trees, and because of that, their food security is also being impacted, right? So this is the reality of the science and how humans are interacting with the science and how the land use for Ethiopia is changing. The other thing we noticed, was thinking about what type of resilience options you can use in a place like Ethiopia. And so we went to an irrigation scheme that was funded by the government. And this is what we saw over there. So we were just standing by the side of the road, looking within this irrigation scheme, talking to the farmers, and this truck shows up, and these people just start throwing maize into that truck that was piled on the side of the farmers. And we were like, well, what are these people doing? And they said, well, everyone knows this is an irrigation scheme, so it's there's tons of water available here. So growing crops is subsidized in this particular scheme, and so they know the farmers here can produce crops for very low cost. And the idea is that they were hoping that this low cost translates into lower prices in the market. However, because the road infrastructure is limited in Ethiopia, and because if you only have one road going to the market, and not many people have access to be distributors in that market, these one distributors showed up and they were basically controlled the entire irrigation scheme. They would show up, they would collect all the food items, and then they would sell it at a markup in the market. So they wouldn't sell it at the reduced price because suddenly they're separated from the farmers. So the farmers, the government's like, well, we're putting you in this irrigation scheme, you should be able to sell this at a lower price. However, because you have this extra actor coming in that can take advantage of this arbitrage opportunity, that arbitrage never reaches consumers, right? And if you ask farmers like, well, why don't you just take your own food to the market? Well, one, because they're growing and working at the same time. Two, if they try and take it, they also told stories of distributors blocking the roads, being like, nope, this is our territory, so you're not allowed to take this food along. I also just want to clarify, this happens in every market, right? This is not particular to Ethiopia. So if it feels like, oh my God, there's corruption and all this stuff. No, like these types of effects you see in the United States as well. But when you're modeling food insecurity, and particularly food, energy, water interactions, it's important to keep track of these types of interactions that are taking place. And so what I'm going to do here is now go through kind of what our goals were overall for this project, and I'm going to provide a description of what we were trying to do. I'm going to talk about the specific modeling framework that I worked on, and the one that allowed us to integrate a lot of these factors into the framework. I'm going to go through sort of two sets of scenarios. I like to call them external scenarios. So something outside of Ethiopia happened, and then internal scenarios, something inside Ethiopia happened. What kind of strategies can we use for resilience? And of course, I'll finish with some conclusions and next steps about what's happening with this project. So first off, the overall project description. This was an NSF-infused project that was funded for over 4 years. So there were tons of collaborators and tons of teams working on this, as you saw in the title slide. But the research questions really were what driving the project over here. And so what we wanted to see was how can you take current energy and agriculture development strategies that influence food security and economic well-being at local level, and particularly considering climate variability and change. So what kind of strategies can we develop that can influence food security and economic well-being? And then finally, we were going to look at thinking about integrated food, energy, water resilience strategies. And these would include somewhere between distributed strategies and centralized strategies. So a distributed strategy you can think of as coming from distributing solar panels or irrigation. A centralized strategy is something more that comes from the central government. So an overall country policy that might impact the country in a big way. And then finally, again, the goal is local food security and economic well-being. And then finally, we also wanted to see if this framework is generalizable. So what we're going to do, we started in Ethiopia, and then now we're in the process of actually doing it in another country in the African continent, which is Mali. The two countries couldn't be more different. I'm happy to talk about why we think those two are good test beds. But we already told you why Ethiopia is a good test bed. Mali provides some different challenges. So how do you go about building a framework, right, that can answer questions like that? So think about the words that we saw on the previous slide. We saw local, centralized, distributed, and scale. So we need to have a framework that can incorporate all those aspects within the model and try and understand how the interactions can scale up. And so one of the things we did, we wanted to make sure was we took a different strategy. So instead of trying to build one model that could incorporate all levels, we said, why don't we take models that are very useful at their particular scales and then try and couple those models differently. So this is slightly different than saying all right, I'm going to take one large model and solve everything, because then the interactions are easy and there's some advantages to that. This is a slightly different way, only because you care more about the interactions and you assume that at the different scales, your models work really well. So at the very largest scale, at the global scale, we had the standard climate models running, standard land use models running that gave an idea about climate change. We had some exogenous commodity prices, for example, where the global oil price might be, and then also what's happening outside of Ethiopia in terms of agreements with countries that border Ethiopia and other things. At a national level, for the country, we modeled this using a computable general equilibrium model. So for those of you that haven't heard of this model, this basically models the entire economy, both microeconomic and a majority of macroeconomic features. So if you want to look at human capital, trade, very sort of macro indicators, but also some micro indicators in terms of local prices, you can use a computable general equilibrium model. At the very lowest scale, we use an agent-based model. So if we're really talking about right at the village scale, trying to understand the interactions between people and how farmers make their decisions, a lot of those don't happen with the standard market assumptions. So you need some idea of irrationality, some idea of uncertainty. And so for that, what we do is at the very, very lowest scale, we model it using an agent-based model. And the one that I'm going to focus on today is what we did at the zonal level. Because if you think about scaling from a very, very local agent-based model all the way up to the country, where you're thinking about all macroeconomic indicators and everything else, then you actually lose a lot of the resolution. And one of the specific things you lose on is some of the things that I pointed out in those first two photos. So for example, for a computable general equilibrium model, you can think about how price differentials might actually cause trade or movement of products between regions. However, in this framework, you can actually think about explicitly representing that infrastructure. So you can think about actually representing road structure and where the roads go. You can think about localized demand. You can think about endogenous investments in things, so endogenously expanding cropping area or making decisions about what kind of crop to plant in which region, which you really can't do at this scale because you're worried about too many other factors. However, if you decide to do at this scale, the zonal level scale, you only look at microeconomic variables. So for example, in this scale, we don't think about trade, international trade with other countries. We don't think about sort of GDP growth and other issues. We don't think about population growth. We assume all the macro factors are held constant, but this zonal level allows us to look at some of these explicit representations of infrastructure. That's what I'm going to go through. I'm going to go through this part of the model. I'm going to talk about how this model kind of integrates everything together and also integrates food, energy, water issues, in particular when we're looking at resilience. Any questions so far? I don't know if I can. John, I think I can take questions, right? If people want to ask questions? Yeah. Okay. Awesome. So what kind of questions do we answer at this level? So the three levels, the agent-based model, the multiplayer microeconomic model, and the computable general equilibrium model. So if you think about the modeling unit, over here it's like a household or a community. Over here it's zonal and multiplayer. And you can't see this, but this says national level sort of modeling over here. Your key features are you can include subrational behavior, agent learning. You can include explicit representation of transportation, storage, infrastructure, zonal disaggregation. And then finally, the CGE allows you to look at economy-wide interactions. And if you want to look at some of the sample research questions that they can answer, specifically, if you want to answer a question about how someone in a particular household is going to change their actions depending on climate variability, you need an agent-based model to do that. However, that model can then be informed by two of these larger scales of what would be happening at that particular large scale. So now focusing on this middle part, let's get to our regional modeling framework and talk about what this modeling framework looks like. And so we're looking at food, energy, and water intersections. And what I told you was that I want to look at explicit representation of infrastructure, but I also want to disaggregate these microeconomic activities. And the reason I want to disaggregate those microeconomic activities is because of the movie you saw. Just looking at production activity and ignoring distribution activity doesn't help you complete the full photo of how resilient you are against your food supply. So we'll have crop producers, crop production activities represented in this model. Excuse me. One of the things I want you to remember is if I say crop producer, what I really mean is crop production activities in a region. So in a particular zone of Ethiopia, I'm looking at crop production activities, and I call it crop producer because I'm taking one particular player, and I'm saying it's as if there was one player in this region, and all those activities can be represented through that. There's the livestock production activities, there's distribution activities that you saw, there's the storage activities that are happening in this region, and then of course there's consumption activities that are happening in each of those zones. The producer sells crops to the distributor, livestock producer sells milk and meat, you sell food to the storage manager, then stores, and then you sell food. And then finally, this can happen in different regions, and the distributor essentially is able to sort of interact these ways. You're also able to put food in storage within regions to try and make sure stuff goes across. These were developed, by the way, in consultation with people in Ethiopia to try and understand how this market works. This was one of the first papers that came out. Our second paper is in review, so if you want more information about how this model works, just the overall structure, this is what it looks like. And then finally, you can trade livestock between livestock producers. Each of these roles, or each of these activities, we model as an optimization problem. And so if there's a lot of studies on this in economics. Your microeconomic theory fails if you're looking at one individual person. But if you look at the scale of a zonal level, you can represent those activities overall as optimization problems, and they have good representation. So, it's almost as if that zone behaves as a rational economic actor. And so for that zone and that activity, we maximize profit or utility, and then we try and have total demand match total supply at the end. And of course, we can play with the structure. Like if there's food waste, we can incorporate that in there. If there are other inefficiencies, we can incorporate within the structure. And so what is the mathematical structure we use? So, for those of you that have seen optimization problems before, it's essentially you minimize or maximize certain types of functions with respect to certain constraints. There's this, and there's one more slide on equations. I'm sorry. Those are the only two ones I'm going to use. But I want to tell you why this becomes such a good integrator, like why this mathematical structure works. So this is a standard optimization problem for those of you who've seen it. Tons of market models and other types of optimization problems are built this way. You minimize or maximize certain objectives with respect to certain constraints. However, if you have many optimization problems, many of these, there's different ways of combining them. You can sort of sum all the objectives up and write all the constraints together, and you're fine. But if you're looking for an equilibrium, one other trick that you can do is actually write it as a complementarity problem, which essentially is trying to find a feasible vector z that satisfies a set of inequality constraints. And you're allowed to have bilinear terms over here. For those of you that don't know what this means, this is just a fancy way of saying take a first derivative. So if I want to solve an optimization problem, one way to minimize a function is I take a first derivative and I set it equal to 0. If I have constraints, I can do the same thing, but I end up with like a slightly different structure. Now the nice thing about this structure is not only have I captured my optimization activities, but I've also captured my total supply equal total demand activities. And I'm able to capture any of the scientific models that we have. So for example, if I wanted to add extra constraints that describe certain type of like differential equations or patterns or other issues that aren't modeled as optimization problems, I can always write them as a system of equalities and inequalities. What I'm telling you over here is that no matter what you're doing in the scale now, if whatever model you want to represent as an equality or an inequality, you can actually integrate with this structure pretty easily. So that's why we stuck with this particular structure. And so what's the advantage of this, right? The idea is that we're using numerical and what the community likes to call bottom-up methods, which means you're representing each activity from the bottom up. I'm not like coming top-down where I'm viewing how these activities work. So computable general equilibrium models, CGEs, are considered top-down because they kind of take the economy and then they scale down. Excuse me. We are starting from the bottom, modeling each activity, and then building up back to the economy. We're looking for an equilibrium between activities, or between several players, if you want to think of Nash equilibrium. And we're not thinking about social planners. So we're allowed to have, like, for example, if we irrigate, we're allowed to have the distributor come in and take advantage of that particular activity. We abstract from general equilibrium effects, so we're not going to consider growth, income, wages. We're going to give all of that to the CGE, and we're going to start with fundamental data to formulate each player's objective to go from there. And again, players aren't individuals. This is activities within a particular zone or a particular region. Right, and here's what we don't do. We're not going to make any baseline projections. So the idea isn't that I'm going to sit down and I'm going to say, this is what I project will happen in the future. And there's a very good reason for that, because these models aren't designed to make projections. They're not like the traditional econometric model or other types of models that project. What we will do is we will say, let's say there's a baseline that we can all agree on, that experts can agree on. And then we say, let's shock this system, and then we'll see how the model reacts. So because we're studying resilience, because we're studying this idea that there's going to be a shock, and then we're going to move, and we want our model to tell us how we're going to move under that shock, we essentially calibrate to a baseline depending on from the literature. And so we're going to do what-if type analysis. I'm going to ask a what-if question. I'm going to give you an answer after that. And a lot of people are like, well, why is that helpful? If you can't tell me the future, why are you even standing over here? And that's really helpful because it helps you analyze different types of regional policies and their regional impacts. So instead of trying to say what will happen tomorrow, if we have some rough idea of like, okay, if this is how the future is going to look, let's see what happens if I shock it one way or the other. And so now we're going to dive into Ethiopia. So I'm going to describe a little bit more of the setting we're in, and then I'm going to start shocking sort of the food, energy, water systems in Ethiopia to see what we come up with. And so Ethiopia is over there in East Africa, the Horn of Africa. If you want some idea of what the statistics look like economy-wise, that's how it is. So 85% of the population, actually their mode of work is agriculture. So 85% are involved in some type of agricultural activities. They're mainly smallholder farms. This northwest region is very fertile. The Choke Mountain area that I showed you is more sort of up in this region right here. And so this is like the fertile part. And then if you look at the southwest, this is the more dry, deserty part of Ethiopia. It's incredibly climate vulnerable, and I'll show you in a second why. Well, if you depend on this much agriculture, it really depends on what your climate activities look like. And then finally, there's humongous hydropower potential, but there's a lack of infrastructure. So right now, they just are about to get online the second largest dam in the African continent, which is the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, right over here. And so already Ethiopia exports electricity. With this, this will become a huge part of Ethiopia's economy. But again, only 30% of the country is electrified. So if you want to know where the hydroelectric power plants are, these small little things give it to you, and that's that big sort of GERD that's going to come in. The regional way we disaggregate, right? So this is, for those of you that have kind of done energy models or any of those types of models before, what we like to do is we like to disaggregate based on certain regions that often are political entities. So it's good to have a state-by-state model for the United States, because really you care about how stuff is traded across states. Policies happen within states, so it's very, very useful. However, for food, and particularly for Ethiopia, it becomes very difficult to figure out how are you going to divide this country into regions. There are some political regions, but those regions span a wide variety of climate and land use type of zones. So these are called adaptation zones. And if you notice, like this is the arid type of adaptation zone, you slowly get humid. But if you look at sort of the semi-arid highlands, they kind of start from the north and go all the way into the south, right? And so if I'm trying to make policy decisions, or I'm trying to look at movement of food between these cities, if I disaggregate my food production by those, it's going to be very, very, so for example, what we've done here is we've created Theus and polygons with the major cities in Ethiopia at the center. So these are the cities between which the major roads are. So this is how food's going to move in the country. We can't model production in these regions because there's so many different types of climate and land use within that region to try and understand what kind of food will grow there. Here's what we do. We model food by the region. So food production is all going to be within each adaptation zone, right? And so now the question is, if we model food production like that, like, so I'm going to say all crop activities in this one region are going to be modeled the same way, and they're going to be aggregated, because I assume that these adaptation zones are the same everywhere. But now the question is, if I've done that and I need to see how food will move, how do I couple my production with my distribution, right? And this is one of the contributions that we made. So when you look at the distribution infrastructure, it's by these regions and these cities. So what we're going to do is we actually, within those frameworks, so within the complementarity modeling framework, I showed you those inequalities and equalities. Within those, we can divide up, for example, if food is produced all over here, what percentage of that is very likely to get transported here and then moved around the country? What percent of that is likely to get transported here and moved around? Those relationships we built within those equalities and inequalities. And then once it's transported, we assume consumption of food also follows these adaptation zones. So these adaptation zones were developed for climate resilience by the Ethiopian government. And they not only represent production activities, but because in a country like Ethiopia, and we were so data poor, we also decided this was a good representation of how consumption activities would go. So consumption preferences are also developed through the types of food that grows in these regions. That's my regional disaggregation. That's where my model works. Just make sure I'm on time. So another sort of type of problem, so if you want to see what the optimization problems look like, they're essentially maximizing different types of objectives. So the producer looks like this, and the distributor looks like this. The one thing I want to point out is there's certain variables relate this. So this pi with subscript m and f, this is the price of the food that the producer sells to the distributors. You'll notice when I'm maximizing this profit, this price times quantity, and then this is the food that the distributor is buying from different producers. And so that's how the problems are linked. And you can think about linking these different types of problems. And I can talk about this later too if anyone wants. I have my setting. Where does my data come from? So I have cropping area in two different seasons. So there's the Kremp season and the Belg season. And then there's also produced quantity. So I have cropping area as my constraints within my production activities, and then I can produce certain things. These zones are the adaptation zones I showed you, so you can see Ethiopia is widely distributed in the type of stuff that is produced and also in the potential of where you can plant. And then finally, the crops that are in our model, teff, sorghum, maize, lentils, wheat, vegetables, and a cash crop, which for those of you that know Ethiopia is essentially just coffee, most of it. We're going to model these activities, these particular types of agricultural products. And now what I'm going to do is I'm finally going to get to the point. I've built this structure, and now I'm going to show you what we can do with this structure, how we can think about resilience in Ethiopia. So how many of you know what teff is? Let's do a little raise of hands. Leon kind of knows. Injera? Exactly. So if you go to an Ethiopian restaurant and you order this Ethiopian bread, it's called injera, and it's like this spongy bread, and it's made from this grain called teff, which is very popular in Ethiopia. It's a small little grain, and then if you cook it, you can make different types. You can make injera with it. You can also make different types of stews with it. But essentially, it's a grain in Ethiopia. It's one of the major grains of Ethiopia. How many of you know what quinoa is? Right? So most of you have heard of quinoa. It was the last superfood that came out of Bolivia. And for those of you that were following what happened with quinoa, the Western world, well, United States, Bolivia is still sort of in the West, right? United States and other sort of northern countries decided that this was going to be the next superfood. Quinoa is going to be incredibly healthy. It's going to have high protein content. And so we all decided to start eating quinoa. Because we started to decide eating quinoa, Bolivia and other countries where it was produced were really stressed by producing it. And so local prices in the country actually went up, and Bolivia became food insecure for a while our markets were driving the price of quinoa. Teff supposedly is supposed to be the next superfood. So if in like 3 or 4 years, if a bunch of you start seeing like, oh my God, teff is coming and like this is going to solve all our health problems, you heard it here first. And so it's predicted to be the next super grain. So what Ethiopia has done is Ethiopia has said, well, if it's going to be the next super grain, we want to limit its export. And so they've actually set an export limit on the amount of teff that can be exported from Ethiopia. And that limit, I'll show you exactly what that limit is in a while. But the idea behind that is, okay, if we set an export limit, we're protecting local markets, right? We're not going to let the price rise like crazy. Disadvantage, which also comes from the other part, is like, well, if you set an export limit, then you're like sort of putting a limit on the resources that Ethiopia can generate by producing teff, right? Like, and a lot of the times, the way this is put across in Ethiopia, because 85%, remember, is agricultural activities. The way it's put across is the farmers are going to make all that profit, and we'll be able to eat other things, so we're perfectly fine. Excuse me, if we put that limit on teff. So, this is the price of teff, and as you can see, excuse me, from 1990 to 2010, there's a certain rise like over here, and then it's expected to rise after that as well, right? So the question is, if I were to sort of shock Ethiopia in this scenario, where I suddenly like have international demand increasing like crazy, and I want to see the impact of this limit, let's see what actually happens to the country. Like what happens to local resilience for local activities if I have this limit or not. And so what we're going to run is we have our base case scenario, and so that we're going to run with the teff export ban. There's also the current level sort of that we're going to run is 100,000 quintal per season teff export with the same global demand. So actually, with our base case scenario, because we were abstracting to just the country, we assume that whatever teff is in the country stays in the country. But the actual export ban right now is this particular one. So 100,000 quintal per season, that's the export ban in place right now in Ethiopia, right? So we want to test how this policy works out in our model. And let's say we, instead of having a ban of 100,000, we say, okay, you're allowed to export more. So 1 million quintal per season of teff export, keep global demand the same. You have a no restriction case, so let export whatever you want. And then what we're going to do is we're going to shock the system by saying all of us start eating teff way more, so we're going to increase global demand by a certain percentage and then run the same scenarios for those two. The question now is, which of these strategies are really good for the local economy? And so the first result we get out is that, in fact, farmers' revenue doesn't change if you look at any of these scenarios. So if you look at the export ban, export limit, and again, when I say farmers' revenue, I'm really talking about revenue from farming activities. That actually doesn't change a lot, even though you are exporting in certain scenarios. And so it's, initially we ran this, we're like, well, why isn't it showing up? There has to be something, there's some activities. And then, it's no surprise that what's really happening is that distribution activities are shifting around and actually taking most of the extra rents that are coming from allowing to export. So if you're exposed to this international price, right? And what we're assuming is that Ethiopia sticks with its current road infrastructure. So this is the road infrastructure it has between cities. We're also assuming, this is also based on local expertise, they said, if anything's going to get exported, it doesn't matter if you're here, here. It all comes to Addis first, which is the central capital city, and then it goes to the rest of the world, right? So we're assuming that the impact of the exports happens at Addis. So, happens at Addis, so everything comes over here. And so what actually happens is that this region, remember I showed you in the beginning, this northern region is very fertile and like has a lot of production activities. They actually start exporting more to Addis. And, and I'm not showing all the trade routes, but this is the important one, right? But they were also sending a bunch of food to this southeast region because this was the dry region. And so because they're exporting more to Addis, there's less food that goes into the southeast. And in fact, what happens is the food goes to Addis, and then through Addis, more food goes into the southeast, but not by a lot. The thickness of the arrow shows you by how much decrease food is going into different places. So while these used to be, the black arrows used to be like quite a bit of food going into the southeast, now, because this goes through Addis, you actually have a reduction of food that's going over, right? So not only, thinking about like, okay, well, one, we talked about activities, which activities will make. If you have a distribution infrastructure set up like this, where it's limited, and you don't have a lot of competition in distribution, then those activities are going to take up the bulk of the profits, right? If you have a more robust distribution infrastructure with tons of roads where food can flow in many places, and you have your economy-wide characteristics of how many distributors there are, then you can actually think about having a more competitive market and the profits flowing down to the farmers as well. So they make the most. The distributors are the ones that extract the most rents. But where do we see regional changes, right? So this is the quantity of food traded in domestic markets. So this means like the amount of food that was produced and given to distributors. So you can sort of see there's an increase in these regions and this region, and mostly around Addis. And this is very different depending on the region you're in. So there's a 15% reduction of what people eat here, mostly because they increase their production activity, send it all to Addis. And in fact, this place isn't producing anything. So there's actually a 1.5% reduction in the amount of food that was coming to market. It's not a very large difference. And there's a reason for that, because this is the one I'm showing you that has 100 quintal export per season. So what I'm showing you over here is that, while in other particular scenarios, you can really, like the farmer gets no revenue, and you can actually have very large changes in price. If you limit it to 100 quintal export, you still get some of the benefits, but you can still protect local markets from changing prices too much. And so that's the essential conclusions of these particular scenarios, is that if you have unregulated exports, they can significantly affect consumption, especially in the eastern part of the country. So it's not just like what will happen in Ethiopia, it's like which parts of Ethiopia are going to get impacted. The transportation constraints really are what keeps this from being kind of an efficient market. So it's really important to know where those roads are. You can't ignore those roads. It's important to know how the food's going to get there, and not just a price differential will bring food there. I didn't show you the other scenarios, but you can see an up to a 20% domestic increase in prices if there's no regulation in place. And that's a humongous increase in critical parts of the country if you think about a food insecure country as well. And then finally, if the way Ethiopia is set up right now, if you start exporting unlimited, most of those profits are going to go to distribution activity. I want to take a little bit more time, if it's okay, John, to go through the second resilience scenario. And this is mostly just to show you, what the capabilities of the model are. So this is an external shock, right? Americans start eating more teff, and then you can decide if you have a centralized strategy to expand or not. Now I'm going to get to a distributed strategy, and I'm going to look at internal type shocks. And this is particularly, we're going to look at the water system. So the water module over here is a gridded model. It has daily time steps. The inputs taken are climate data, soil properties, crop characteristics. The intermediate variables are soil moisture change, root growth, evapotranspiration. The outputs that come out of our sort of water model is a yield factor for growing crops, and then groundwater recharge, runoff, and base flow to surface water. We have meteorological inputs that are coming into this model as well. And then this is calibrated to match Ethiopia LDAS outputs based on from these particular models. Ying has created these beautiful slides, so I'm already going to thank her for this, and she's right there. So, and of course, if anyone has questions, Ying can answer them. And so what we're focusing on is crop characteristics and yield factor, because that's how the water module interacts with the food module that I just showed you. Those are the inputs that go inside what's happening to the food in terms of its growth. Right? And if you want to look at how irrigation, so if we decide to have small-scale irrigation in Ethiopia, how it sort of moves across the model, what it does is, obviously it goes into the water crop and yield model. It talks about impact on water conditions. It affects crop yield and irrigation water consumption, and then it goes into your food model, impact on food security, and then eventually we can get to the red box. However, irrigation will also impact what's happening to your hydropower. It talks about hydroelectricity generation, goes in your electricity model. So I'm not going to talk about energy today, but there's an energy module in our particular structure as well. And then finally, this can, again, have a cycle back to electrified irrigation to impact it again. This is our sort of big framework goal of what we're trying to get. All these pieces aren't in place, but I'm going to show you where one of a few pieces are in place right now. And so the question is, if we introduce small-scale irrigation throughout the country. How does that improve food security and economic well-being under changing climate and water resource conditions? And so just to give you an idea of how this model works, you really will realize that I am not an expert in this, but I'm going to try and go through this. There's precipitation, there's some interception by the crops or plants, and then water lands to the ground. There's some runoff that eventually goes into the rivers. Some of it goes into groundwater, and then we have soil depth gridded by our particular land use model. There's a soil moisture change depending on the soil depth and how much water is coming in. There's root depth, there's evapotranspiration that leaves, and then finally some of it goes into groundwater storage recharge, which then eventually ends up in base flow going towards rivers that then impacts the electricity generated by going into a dam. And then finally, if you added electrified irrigation, you can take some of that groundwater and also sort of get it out from there. So what we're going to look at is we're going to look at an irrigation scenario under a year where we didn't have a lot of rainfall. So this is total precipitation. So 2015 is our year. We're going to shock the system with 2015 rainfall. This was an El Nino year. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over there, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to see if I provide 2 millimeter per day irrigation to maize, just for growing maize right now. And there's, because we wanted to see sort of the most impact, maize can be impacted by the irrigation that you apply to. So we're going to apply it to maize, and then we're going to see what happens. So if you look at Ethiopia just by itself, so with no irrigation, this is the climate yield factor. The climate yield factor says if there's a certain amount of water or precipitation, how much food are we going to grow? So the higher the climate yield factor, the more food you can grow. The lower, the less food you can grow. So if you have irrigation coming in Ethiopia, this is how our climate yield factors change, the type of irrigation that I showed you. So this is my resilience strategy. My shock is going to be an El Nino year with low rainfall. My resilience strategy is to try and get irrigation to the country and see what happens. And so what you see is, again, it's a distributed impact. So in the base case, this is what our farming area assigned looks like. And then the red line kind of shows you the percentage of crop area that's used. So you're using about, the maximum you use is in this region, the arid region, using about 30%. And then in other regions, for example, this is the very, very dry region, you're using like no percentage of zonal area. And these are the types of crops that are grown, right? So essentially, it's the distribution that I showed you on the map. What I'm going to do now is, if you look at the change in farming area and you put in irrigation into this scenario, obviously I'm saying let's irrigate maize. So that's where I'm putting the advantage. So you'll see an increase in the growth of maize in this particular region, and you see a decrease in the other crops. And it's not clear which particular crop it's displacing. There's sort of an equal displacement of these crops. And I can talk about this later, but those of you that know these models, there could be multiple solutions as well. But the solution that we came out with was essentially maize is displacing other types of food to kind of come in over here. And then finally, the change in production. So again, there's small changes in certain other regions, and you can see over here there's a little change. There's very little change, minute change in other types of crops. So even though you changed your area, your production really was what was impacted. So the other sort of crops still came in, but your production of maize was the highest, but the change in production of the other ones was very, very low. So this irrigation, essentially what it's doing is it's giving you this free maize. And what we're seeing is that people are able to utilize that and still sort of eat the other crops that are in that region. Your groundwater storage, how that changed. So depending on which region you're in again. And again, like I showed you, this model provides different ways how groundwater can be stored and recharged. So depending on the region of Ethiopia, again, and depending on how the precipitation was spread, where we were taking the water, this particular region, in fact, saw an increase in groundwater storage change. And then because of irrigation, due to the climate that was coming in. And then the rest, essentially we were depleting groundwater because of irrigation that was coming in this way. And so some conclusions, again, this particular scenario, I'm sorry I rushed through it a little bit, but essentially I was trying to show you the capabilities of trying to shock the system, the climate shock, and how that could feed back into the food system as well. And then finally, the future work we're doing right now is trying to connect more stuff for energy. So trying to build an energy module that we can think about production of electricity and also production of biomass, which is the majority of what happens in Ethiopia. And so in terms of next steps, I think what we showed you was like how you can use partial equilibrium and some of these complementarity problems to actually integrate these different types of models. understanding your activities is very important, and especially explicit representation of transportation can really help you understand what's going to happen to food security. And then finally, next major steps are linking some of these other things to energy and seeing what happens there. And then finally, like I didn't show you any model coupling in this, still working on the project, but hopefully one of the next steps is linking with some of the other models that we have and sort of getting some of these insights all together. Okay. Awesome. And want to thank Dr. Ying Zhang, and she's sitting right there, and Dr. Sriram Shankararayanan, and he's actually in Montreal right now. So they worked really hard on all this work. Awesome. Thank you.
Questions?
Can you, I mean, on the main thing you're trying to do, it'd be very difficult to validate. But for example, in the second case you showed, you could run the cases for the different years. And you have obviously high precipitation, low precipitation. I would imagine sometimes precipitation is distributed differently across your different regions, which would affect crops, crop yields in different places, transportation. So do you have economic information that you can essentially try to calculate those things and validate? Because otherwise, it's a nice model, but does it work?
Right. That's a great point. So the way validation, we validate a model like this is essentially run it for several high and low scenarios. So like exactly what you were saying. So run it when there's more rainfall, less rainfall, see if it matches historical patterns. That's essentially where we're, so essentially when we calibrate our base case, that base case is calibrated against tons of like sort of sensitivity. So like high, low, seeing if it matches the output that was there. And so that's essentially all we can do to validate. We can't validate the shocks because then we'll need a particular shock year and then see what happens over there, as well as some idea of like what resilience look like. But the other baseline we can validate by the data we have. Now, the one thing you said that we can't do is translate all the way to complete economic activity at the lower level. So, we can have high, low years, and we have data on food production from those years, food production and where it's going. What we don't have is how individual people, individual regions, what they're eating and what their economic benefits are, for example. So I can't validate, for example, how much total money is being made from certain activities. That we can only estimate from the baseline prices and quantities we have.
But can't you look at those different years and even the price of various commodities and plot your estimate of the price versus the actual price? Show a scatter plot?
So getting price data for each year from Ethiopia for each region there's actually it was very, very difficult. So price data was incredibly hard to come by. We actually had to get price data for 1 year, and we said, okay, this is the price that we're going to try and calibrate to. And that's also why I didn't show you any prices, because the prices in these models are not calibrated essentially to anything, right? The only thing I can talk about is percentage change in prices. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. If I had that price data, that would be a wonderful plot to have and look at it.
So following up on that. So how much was data an issue? So what you see often here in this kind of activity is it's kind of a fascinating difference between the power of the tools that are applied to these applications and the quality of the data. But it sounds like you had decent data. Is that right?
So, and this will give me a chance to talk a little bit about Mali as well, why Mali is so interesting to us. We had decent production data from the Ethiopian Statistical Agency. The other nice thing we had were those climate adaptation zones. So there were tons of studies on what the soil looks like, what is grown where, like how does rainfall impact growth of crops and things like that. So the nice thing was the science was good and the adaptation zones were good, and the production of food we captured relatively well. The place we didn't have good data on was consumption. The consumption was a big problem in this particular model, right? Like I said, consumption preferences are essentially what production zones look like, only because we assume that most of the people in regions, they will be used to eating whatever is produced in that region.
Right.
And so that's the consumption data is the best. So the good thing here, because we had contacts in the Ethiopian Statistical Agency, we were able to get really good production data. And I think the thing that helped all our models was, was this thing. Prices, no. Oh, sorry. Am I going back? The thing that really helped was our regionalization. I'm not going to go back. But you remember that regionalization map where I showed all the adaptations? That was the most helpful thing because Ethiopia had already done that study and they already knew where stuff was grown, what that climate looked like, what the land use looked like. And so we were able to generate a lot. So even if we didn't know, for example, in every year what was produced there, that at least gave us some indication of okay, if we put this in a crop model, at least we know the inputs going in are good. The thing about Mali is that consumption in Mali, we actually have really good consumption data in Mali. And so that'll be the really exciting thing. There's a study done in Mali about what people are eating almost every month, for the last 2 or 3, and it's the products they were buying, what they were eating, how many households, what they prefer to eat, and so that's going to be the exciting part about Mali. The bad thing about Mali is there's literally no production data, because it comes in from the outside.
Yeah, exactly.
So, okay, let's conclude, and thanks, speaker again.
Sure. Thanks, John. Thank you. No, thank you.